The Whitman family's Thanksgiving had always been more than just turkey and pie. It was a stage where Charles Whitman, patriarch and founder of Whitman Systems, reminded everyone at the table why his name was etched into New England's business history. This year, however, the air felt different. The fire in the stone hearth crackled against the November chill. Silverware gleamed under the chandelier, and 3 generations gathered around the 12-foot mahogany table. It was the kind of scene you'd find in a holiday commercial, until Charles cleared his throat. "I'm selling the company," he announced, voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the room's warmth. $50 million, and none of you will inherit a dime. Gasps broke the polite silence. Bradley, the eldest son groomed to take over, nearly dropped his wine glass. Lacey, the youngest, stopped mid-live stream, her phone catching every stunned expression. But it was Evelyn, the quiet middle child, who didn't flinch. She simply leaned forward, eyes steady on her father. "Who's buying it?" she asked. Charles smiled, clearly enjoying his moment of control. "Summit Ventures. They'll be here tomorrow to finalize the deal." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Interesting," she said, "because I am Summit Ventures." The clink of silverware froze. For the first time in her life, every eye at the table was on her, and none of them knew what was coming next. For a moment, the room was locked in stunned silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Bradley stared at his sister as if she'd just spoken a foreign language. Lacey's phone hung limply at her side, her live stream audience now filling the comments with wild speculation. And Charles didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair, jaw set, as if bracing himself for whatever came next. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you'd have to go back decades to when Evelyn Whitman was still Evie, the bright-eyed middle child who seemed to live in a different orbit from the rest of her family, while Bradley was out on the golf course with their father learning how to talk deals before he could legally drive, and Lacey was playing dress-up in the front parlor. Evie was holed up in the attic with an old Gateway computer and a stack of programming books from the public library. She wasn't just good with computers, she understood them, saw patterns where others saw chaos. By the time she was 12, she'd built her first functional program, a scheduling tool for her school's science club. At 15, she coded an early mobile app that helped local businesses track inventory. Teachers encouraged her. Friends marveled. But at home, it barely registered. Her father's world revolved around Whitman Systems, a regional leader in business software that Charles had grown from a small operation into a multi-million-dollar firm. But in his mind, real business wasn't about tinkering with ideas. It was about power lunches, handshake deals, and knowing the right people at the country club. That gap between them only widened as Evelyn got older. At Stanford, she double-majored in computer science and business, graduating summa cum laude. She came home eager to contribute, her head full of concepts for modernizing the company's aging software and breaking into the cloud services market. The Whitman boardroom was where it all came crashing down. She'd spent weeks crafting a pitch for a cloud integration platform, something she believed could future-proof the business for the next 2 decades. The day she presented it, she walked into the paneled room with her laptop under one arm and her confidence high. Charles sat at the head of the table, flanked by board members, men in dark suits, most of them lifelong friends or former golf partners. 10 minutes into her presentation, her father checked his watch. At 12 minutes, he interrupted. "Evie," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "this is creative, but it's not practical. Our clients want stability, not some experimental idea fresh out of a college classroom." The board chuckled politely. Evelyn closed her laptop without a word, but inside, something shifted. The humiliation burned deep. She realized right then that she could win every award, graduate top of her class, and it would still never be enough because she wasn't the heir he'd chosen. From that day forward, she stopped trying to earn her father's approval. She moved to Seattle with just over $6,000 in her bank account and a few boxes of possessions. Her first apartment was the kind of place where the heater rattled in the night and the kitchen window wouldn't quite close in the winter. She took on every coding job she could find, sometimes working for little more than rent money, while quietly building her own vision of what a modern tech company could be. And though she never told her family, she began laying the first bricks of Summit Ventures. That's why, sitting at the Thanksgiving table all these years later, her declaration wasn't just a business reveal, it was the culmination of a decade-long journey. From the attic computer to the head of her own multi-million-dollar enterprise, she'd been invisible to them for years. Tonight, she had their full attention. Evelyn didn't leave Maine with a grand send-off or even a family hug at the train station. She left quietly, a single suitcase in hand, while the rest of the Whitman household carried on as if she were just heading back to school. In truth, she was heading toward a life that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Seattle greeted her with gray skies, the scent of rain-soaked pavement, and a one-room apartment barely big enough to hold a bed, a desk, and the tiny kitchenette that doubled as her dining table. The radiator groaned through the night, the windows let in the cold, and the creaky floors whispered with every step. Her bank account held just over $6. Zero savings from college tutoring gigs and a few freelance projects. She knew it wouldn't last long, so she threw herself into work, any work she could find. By day, she coded for small businesses desperate for someone who could fix their clunky systems. By night, she taught herself everything she could about emerging tech trends, cloud infrastructure, and how to run a company without leaning on a family name. The first few years were punishing. Evelyn lived on canned soup and bulk store coffee, choosing between paying for better internet speeds or replacing her worn-out shoes. There were nights she fell asleep at her desk, only to wake up stiff-necked and groggy, still staring at lines of code. But she kept going because every client she took on wasn't just income, it was research. She was studying the needs of modern businesses, and more importantly, how outdated systems like her father's were bleeding money. It was in year 2 that she quietly registered a new business, Summit Ventures LLC. She signed the paperwork under the name E.J. Stone, short for Evelyn Jane, but anonymous enough that no one would trace it back to her. She wanted her success or failure to stand on its own, without the Whitman shadow looming over it. Summit began as a custom software solutions firm for small startups, reinvesting every dime of profit back into the business. At first, it was just Evelyn and one part-time assistant she could barely afford. But by year 3, she'd developed her first proprietary platform and integration tool that allowed old, clunky business systems to seamlessly connect with modern cloud applications. It was eerily similar to the idea she'd pitched to the Whitman board years earlier, the one they'd laughed off as impractical. The platform was a breakthrough. Startups began talking. Word spread. Soon, Summit was handling accounts from mid-sized firms in Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta. Venture capitalists started calling, but Evelyn refused to sell control. She'd seen what happened when vision was sacrificed for a quick payout. Instead, she grew slowly, methodically acquiring smaller tech outfits whose products could strengthen Summit's portfolio. Every acquisition was strategic. Every contract negotiation sharpened her instincts. And with each passing year, the gap between her and Whitman systems widened, not just in product innovation, but in relevance. By the 7th year, Summit Ventures had offices in Seattle, Austin, and New York, with a valuation north of $200 million. And yet, her family still thought she was getting by, maybe running some little tech thing on the West Coast. Evelyn kept it that way on purpose. She dressed simply when visiting home, downplayed her achievements, and avoided any mention of her client roster. To them, she was still the daughter who'd walked away after a failed pitch, ambitious, maybe, but ultimately inconsequential. Privately, she was laying the foundation for something far bolder. For the past 18 months, Summit had been quietly buying minority stakes in Whitman systems suppliers and major clients. Evelyn studied every quarterly report, every public filing, learning exactly where the company was bleeding. She knew their contracts, their pricing structures, their weaknesses. Then, 6 months before that fateful Thanksgiving, she made her move. Through a third-party broker, Summit Ventures sent an acquisition proposal coded Project Horizon to Whitman Systems Board. It offered fresh capital, tech upgrades, and the retention of the Whitman name. Charles rejected it almost immediately. He never even made it past the first page. Evelyn didn't take it personally. She'd expected it, and in some ways, it was better this way. Because now, when the deal finally went through, he wouldn't just be surprised, he'd be blindsided. Asterisk. By the time her father brushed off Project Horizon without a second glance, Evelyn was already 3 moves ahead. She'd learned early in business and in life that the first answer was rarely the final one, especially when ego was involved. She doubled down. Over the next 6 months, Summit Ventures quietly tightened its grip on the ecosystem that Whitman Systems depended on. It wasn't about attacking her father's company, it was about surrounding it. She bought a controlling stake in North Shore Components, their primary hardware supplier. Through a shell subsidiary, she acquired Brightwave Solutions, the niche software vendor that provided Whitman's security updates. Then came Harborview Logistics, a regional distributor that moved nearly half of Whitman Systems' packaged products to clients across the Midwest. Every deal was public record, but she kept her own name off the paperwork. To the outside world, it looked like a series of unconnected acquisitions. To Evelyn, it was a chessboard, and Whitman Systems was moving closer to checkmate. Her most daring move came in year 10, when she went after 2 of Whitman's largest clients. The first, Lakeford Manufacturing, had been with her father's company for over 20 years. Evelyn's team offered them an integration platform that could save them 18% in annual operating costs, bundled with a long-term service contract. The second, Westland Distributors, jumped ship after a single demo of Summit's cutting-edge dashboard analytics. By the time the ink dried on those contracts, Charles Whitman's company was tethered to Summit Ventures in ways he couldn't see and wouldn't understand until it was too late. The actual takeover plan was as precise as any engineering blueprint. Evelyn would wait until Whitman Systems' next fiscal dip, a period she knew was coming, thanks to her meticulous review of their outdated product pipeline. Then, through a trusted intermediary, Summit Ventures would come back with an offer that Charles couldn't ignore. She also understood timing wasn't just about business cycles, it was about emotion. And there was no better moment to pull the curtain than Thanksgiving, when the entire Whitman family would be under one roof. There would be no whispered phone calls to think it over, no quiet strategy sessions with Bradley in the corner office. It would be public, it would be undeniable, and it would be hers. The closer the date came, the more deliberate she became about her presentation. She wasn't just closing a deal, she was staging a revelation. In the weeks before the holiday, she commissioned a discreet tailor in Seattle to update her wardrobe. Gone were the muted blouses and neutral flats she wore on family visits. In their place, a deep navy Chanel sheath dress, a tailored charcoal Armani suit, and understated but unmistakable markers of success diamond studs from Tiffany's, a Patek Philippe watch, a Bottega Veneta handbag. She booked a private jet from Boeing Field to Portland, Maine, despite normally flying commercial. When the broker confirmed the flight, she added one final touch, a black Bentley waiting on the tarmac at the other end. It wasn't about showing off, it was about letting her father and siblings see the clues. Before the truth landed, a week before Thanksgiving, her assistant slid the final deal folder across her desk. "If they sign at the table, everything is locked," the assistant said. Evelyn nodded, though she already knew the documents were ironclad. The Whitman Systems board had been quietly reviewing the offer for weeks, swayed by a combination of necessity and the generous $50 million price tag. The night before her flight, her oldest friend, Marissa, called from across town. "You're really going to do this at the dinner table?" she asked, half laughing, half worried. "I'm doing it where it all began," Evelyn replied. "In the same room where I learned I'd never be taken seriously." She didn't sleep much that night. Not out of doubt those days were long gone, but because the clock was finally running down on a game she'd been playing for a decade. By the time she stepped onto the Bentley's plush carpet the next morning, the plan was already past the point of reversal. The contracts were signed, the wire transfers were queued, The only thing left was to look her father in the eye and tell him the truth. That the company he built, the one he thought he controlled until his dying breath, now belonged to the daughter he'd underestimated the most. The Whitman estate looked exactly as Evelyn remembered: 3 stories of white clapboard and black shutters, standing proud against the late November wind off the Atlantic. The lawn, though dusted with frost, was clipped to perfection, and a wreath hung on the front door, its deep red bough fluttering in the cold. Her mother, Margaret, answered the door in a cranberry cashmere sweater and pearls, her perfume mingling with the faint scent of roasted turkey from the kitchen. "Evelyn, darling," she said, giving her a quick embrace, "you look different." Her eyes flicked over the tailored coat, the polished heels, the understated but unmistakably expensive watch. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Good to see you, too, Mom." Inside, the usual Thanksgiving chaos was underway. Bradley was already at the sideboard pouring himself a generous glass of scotch, his voice booming as he bragged about a major client win that Evelyn knew had actually been handled by one of Whitman Systems' junior account managers. Lacey breezed in from the kitchen, phone in hand, narrating the scene for her 1.2 million followers. "Family time. Turkey's almost ready," she chirped before leaning in to air-kiss Evelyn. "Wow, you look fancy. New boyfriend?" Evelyn sidestepped the bait with a polite, "Just working hard." They sat down at the long mahogany dining table, its surface gleaming under the crystal chandelier. Sterling silverware caught the candlelight, and the scent of sage and thyme drifted from the steaming dishes. Bradley took his usual place to Charles's right, Lacey to his left, while Evelyn was positioned down at the far end next to her mother, a seating arrangement that spoke volumes. Dinner began with the family's traditional gratitude round, though over the years it had devolved into a not-so-subtle competition over who could announce the most impressive achievement. Bradley went first, toasting his record-breaking quarter at Whitman Systems and his new 42-foot yacht. Lacey followed, gushing about reaching 1 million followers and signing a deal with a luxury cosmetics brand. When it was Evelyn's turn, she kept it simple. "I'm thankful for the lessons life has taught me," she said evenly, "that rejection can lead to the right path, that persistence outlasts privilege, and that sometimes the best teacher is time." Her father gave her a puzzled glance but moved on. It was only when the pumpkin and pecan pies were brought out that Charles tapped his water glass with a knife, commanding silence. "I have an announcement," he began, his voice carrying the same authority it had in boardrooms for decades. "After months of negotiations, I've decided to sell Whitman Systems. The deal will be finalized tomorrow." Bradley nearly choked on his wine. "You can't be serious." Lacey's eyes went wide. "But what about the Whitman legacy?" Charles held up a hand. "The buyer is Summit Ventures. They're paying $50 million, which is more than fair given our recent market challenges." It was then Evelyn set down her fork, folded her napkin, and looked directly at him. "That's interesting," she said, her voice calm but carrying down the length of the table. "Because I am Summit Ventures." The room went still. Bradley's glass tipped, crimson wine bleeding across the white linen. Lacey froze mid-live stream, her viewers no doubt flooding the comments. Margaret's hand tightened around her own wine glass. Evelyn continued, her tone steady. "I've been building Summit Ventures for the past 10 years. The contracts are signed. The board has approved the sale. As of tomorrow morning, Whitman Systems will be part of my company." Charles stared at her, shock giving way to anger. "This is absurd. Summit Ventures is run by E.J. Stone, not..." She slid a platinum business card case across the table. "E.J. Stone, Evelyn Jane Whitman, me." The silence was so complete she could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply met her father's gaze and waited for him to realize that the daughter he had once dismissed had just bought the empire he thought he'd passed to his chosen heir. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fireplace at the far end of the dining room. Bradley recovered first, slamming his palm against the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "You planned this to humiliate us," he spat. "You've been spying on the company, undermining Dad." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. "No, Bradley, it's called market research. Every fact I know about Whitman Systems came from public reports and legal channels. I made an offer. The board accepted. That's business." Bradley's face flushed a deep crimson, his eyes darting to their father for backup. But Charles was still staring at the business card in his hand, as if the platinum rectangle might somehow rewrite itself with a more palatable truth. Lacey finally lowered her phone, the reality apparently sinking in that this wasn't just family drama for her followers. "So, you're our boss now?" she asked, her voice half joking, half terrified. "Technically, yes," Evelyn said evenly. "But the management structure will be changing drastically." Charles pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "This deal is off. I won't sell my company to my own daughter as part of some revenge plot." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Dad, the contracts are signed. The wire transfers are already queued. Legally, Summit Ventures owns Whitman Systems as of this morning. The announcement goes public at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow." Bradley let out a humorless laugh. "You think you can just waltz in and run this place? You don't know half of what I've done to keep it afloat." Evelyn's gaze locked on him. "Like the $350,000 you siphoned through fake vendor accounts, or the offshore transfers tied to your gambling debts." The color drained from Bradley's face. "You can't prove. I have transaction records, account numbers, and IP logs from your office computer." Evelyn cut in. "I'm not pressing charges yet, but you will resign your executive position. Quietly, you'll repay the funds, and if you want any future role, you'll earn it starting with an MBA." Margaret's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "Evelyn," she began, but her daughter's focus never wavered. Bradley shoved back his chair and stormed from the room, muttering something about betrayal. Lacey looked between her parents and sister, eyes narrowing with calculation. "You know," she said slowly, "if you want to make this takeover look good to the public, you're going to need a relatable, human-facing presence, someone who can make a tech company feel approachable." Evelyn almost smiled. "You mean you?" Lacey straightened. "I have 1.2 million followers, most of them in demographics you're not even reaching. I could be your brand ambassador, give this whole thing a lifestyle spin. And in exchange?" Evelyn asked. Lacey shrugged. "You keep me in the loop. Maybe help me launch a podcast. It's a win-win." It was shamelessly transactional, but Evelyn had to admit Lacey wasn't entirely wrong. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone cool but not dismissive. Charles, who had been pacing by the fireplace, turned abruptly. "You can't have it both ways, Evelyn. You can't be my daughter and the person who took my company." Evelyn met his gaze. "That's where you're wrong. I've always been both. You just refuse to see it." The words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken resentment. Margaret set her glass down with a soft clink. "Perhaps it's time we all saw things a little more clearly," she said quietly. Charles's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He simply left the room, the echo of the heavy study doors closing reverberating down the hallway. Evelyn remained at the table, the half-eaten pecan pie cooling in front of her. It wasn't victory she felt, at least not the kind she'd once imagined. It was something heavier, a recognition that the battle she'd just won was only the first of many to come. In the days after Thanksgiving, the Whitman estate felt strangely quiet, as though the grand old house itself was holding its breath. Bradley had moved his things out of the corner office at Whitman Systems without a word to anyone, delivering a single-line resignation email that morning. Evelyn's conditions had been clear: repay the stolen funds, step down without spectacle, and if he wanted any future role, earn it through hard work, starting with an MBA program. To her surprise, within a month, she learned he'd enrolled at Boston University's business school. Whether it was a genuine desire to rebuild his life or just a way to save face, she didn't know. But for now, it was enough. Lacey's pivot was swifter and more calculated. Within 48 hours of the takeover announcement, she had rebranded herself as the Whitman Insider on her social media platforms, spinning the family saga into a narrative of empowerment and modern business reinvention. Her followers loved it. Evelyn, initially skeptical, couldn't deny the bump in consumer interest for Whitman Summit Technology's smaller, consumer-facing products. Lacey had an instinct for turning spectacle into opportunity, a skill Evelyn was willing to use, so long as her sister kept it professional. The biggest surprise came from her father. In the first weeks, Charles kept his distance, showing up at the office only when necessary, maintaining an icy politeness in their interactions. But slowly, something shifted. He began attending meetings with younger staff members, not to assert control, but to share industry stories, client histories, and lessons learned the hard way. It was at one of these sessions, a casual Friday coffee with the product development team, that Evelyn overheard him say, "Don't ignore a good idea just because it's not yours. Trust me, I learned that one the hard way." He didn't look at her when he said it, but she knew who it was meant for. Margaret's transformation was subtler, but no less meaningful. For years, she had played the role of peacemaker by avoiding conflict altogether. But after that Thanksgiving, she began volunteering with a women's entrepreneurship nonprofit, eventually joining the board of a local tech incubator for female founders. "I want to make sure other mothers don't repeat my mistakes," she told Evelyn one afternoon over coffee. "I should have fought harder for you back then." The office itself underwent its own evolution. The outdated cubicle layout was replaced with open, collaborative workspaces. New technology stations were installed, and for the first time in years, employee morale seemed to lift. Evelyn retained about 60% of the staff, focusing on retraining and integrating them into Summit's systems. Some veterans of the old Whitman era embraced the changes. Others chose retirement or moved on. 6 months later, Whitman Summit Technologies had posted its first quarterly report since the merger. Client retention at 98%, new contracts up 30%, and revenue growth exceeding projections. It wasn't just a business win, it was validation that her vision worked. One evening, as she and her father reviewed the numbers in the glass-walled conference room overlooking Portland Harbor, Charles set down the report and looked at her. "You've accomplished more in your first year than I did in my first 10, he admitted quietly. For a moment, she wasn't the CEO or the middle child or the boardroom outsider. She was just his daughter, hearing something she'd waited decades to hear. Not because she needed validation to define her worth, she'd built that herself, but because it was the human recognition she'd longed for. The next Thanksgiving was a smaller affair. No staged gratitude speeches, no grand announcements. Just family, a few close friends, and a table where everyone's voice carried equal weight. There were still moments of tension, and not all wounds had healed. But the old hierarchy had been replaced with something resembling mutual respect. Evelyn had learned something important in that year. Success could be measured in revenue, market share, and industry recognition, but the truest measure was whether the people who once underestimated you could finally meet you eye to eye. The second Thanksgiving after the takeover was nothing like the one that had set everything in motion. Gone were the tense undercurrents and unspoken rivalries. The guest list was smaller, the table less formal, and for the first time in years, laughter flowed as easily as the wine. Evelyn noticed the changes in small details, the way her father asked her opinion about a new client over coffee instead of making pronouncements, the way Bradley spoke about his MBA classes without defensiveness, and the way Lacey set her phone aside for entire stretches of conversation. Even her mother seemed lighter, more present, as if she'd finally stepped out from behind a role she'd played for decades. Business was thriving. Whitman Summit Technologies had established itself as a respected player in the enterprise integration market, with 3 new product lines and a customer base that spanned the country. The press praised the company's turnaround, often framing it as a story of innovative leadership meeting legacy. Wisdom, Evelyn didn't mind the phrase, it felt accurate. Her father's decades of relationships and her modern strategies had merged into something neither of them could have built alone. But sitting in her office late one Friday night, looking out at the lights of Portland Harbor, she realized that the real victory wasn't the company's growth charts or the accolades from industry publications. It was the way the people around her had changed, and the way she had changed with them for years. She had told herself that proving her father wrong would be enough, that success would fill the space left by his dismissal, that market share and revenue growth could replace the acceptance she'd never received. And in the days right after the takeover, when headlines splashed her story across business news, it had felt intoxicating. She'd won. She'd taken the crown from the heir apparent and claimed it for herself. But in the quiet that followed, she discovered something unsettling. Being right didn't heal anything by itself. The rift in the family remained, and the victories felt hollow in the absence of understanding. That's when she began to shift her focus from proving herself to them to building something with them. She didn't forget the years of being overlooked, but she started to see her father's choices in a broader light. A man shaped by his own era, who'd been taught to believe that leadership was passed down to sons, not daughters. It didn't excuse his blind spots, but it explained them, and in turn, Charles began to see that his assumptions had cost him more than business opportunities. They had cost him years of connection with his own child. That realization softened him in ways Evelyn had never imagined possible. They still disagreed often, but now it was the kind of disagreement that came with mutual respect, the kind where each side actually listened. Bradley was still brash, but he'd begun to take his studies seriously, occasionally calling Evelyn for advice on case studies. Lacey remained unapologetically self-promotional, but she'd proven herself a skilled ambassador, opening doors in markets Evelyn had once considered unreachable. The lesson Evelyn carried forward was one she wished she'd understood years earlier, that winning and resolving aren't the same thing. You can win a fight, close a deal, even take the crown and still find yourself standing alone in the victory circle. Resolution required something harder: vulnerability, patience, and the willingness to offer a second chance, even when it wasn't asked for. As she set the final agenda for the next week's board meeting, her father knocked on her open office door. "Dinner?" he asked simply. She smiled, closing her laptop. "Dinner." Walking out together into the crisp Maine evening, she thought about how far they'd come, not just in business, but in the fragile, ongoing work of becoming a family again. In the end, the empire she'd built wasn't just measured in market value. It was measured in the space she'd created for them all to stand as equals, and in the quiet knowledge that they had finally learned how to see each other clearly. And that, she realized, was the kind of success worth keeping. Evelyn Whitman spent years believing that success was the only way to heal the wound of being overlooked. She built her company in silence, outmaneuvered her rivals, and even bought the empire her father once believed she could never run. But in the quiet after the victory, she learned something far more profound: winning doesn't always bring peace. What truly mattered was what came next: rebuilding bridges, earning trust, and allowing herself to see her family not as the people who doubted her, but as people capable of change. That shift turned her triumph into something richer than any business deal. It turned it into reconciliation. In life, we often fight to prove others wrong, believing that will fill the emptiness their doubt created. But the deeper victory lies in proving ourselves right by building something lasting, meaningful, and big enough to include even those who once stood against us. True success isn't measured only by what you achieve, it's measured by who you become in the process, and by the relationships you choose to mend along the way. Your turn. Have you ever worked so hard to prove someone wrong, only to realize the real reward was something else entirely? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more powerful, real-life lessons.